10,000 Swedes, 35,000 Russians, a fortress under siege, a blizzard turning day into white chaos, and an 18-year-old king who just told his officers they would attack. November 30th, 1700, outside the Estonian town of Narva. The temperature drops, wind shifts, snow drives straight into Russian eyes. In 30 minutes, the battlefield turns into a graveyard. How does a force outnumbered 4-1 shatter an entrenched army? What happens when nature becomes a weapon? Why does this battle break Russia so completely that they lose their entire artillery train and 20,000 prisoners walk home without muskets? By 1700, Sweden owns the Baltic. The empire stretches from Finland through Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and plants flags in northern Germany at Stralsund, Wismar, and Pomerania. Population 1.5 million. But the army is a machine, blue uniforms with yellow facings, flintlock muskets with socket bayonets that let you fire with the blade fixed. Discipline drilled into bones. Europe watches and calls them the finest force on the continent. Then Charles XI dies. His son takes the throne in 1697, Charles XII, 15 years old, no battle experience. 3 neighbors see an opening, Frederick IV of Denmark, Augustus the Strong of Saxony, who also wears Poland's crown, and Peter I of Russia forge a secret alliance at Preobrazhenskoye in 1699. The plan is simple. Hit Sweden from 3 sides, while the boy king learns which end of a sword is sharp. They call it payback for decades of Swedish expansion. Denmark invades Holstein-Gottorp in March 1700. Augustus marches on Riga with a Saxon army in February. Russia waits until August, signs peace with the Ottoman Empire. Then Peter declares war and sends his forces towards Swedish Ingria. The coalition expects victory by Christmas. Charles moves first. June 16th, 1700, he boards the flagship King Charles at Karlskrona. British and Dutch fleets sail with him. They land at Humlebæk, north of Copenhagen, on July 20th. Danish forces are stuck in Holstein to the south. Frederick IV watches Swedish troops march toward his capital and sues for peace. Treaty of Travendal signed August 18th. Denmark is out. 1 month, 1 war ended. Charles turns east. Peter is besieging Narva by September. The city sits in Estonia, Swedish territory, on the Narva River. Garrison of 1,800 men with 297 artillery pieces. Russian bombardment starts October 31st. The siege camp stretches around the fortress in a half circle of earthworks and trenches. Charles crosses the Baltic with Estonian and Finnish regiments joining his Swedish corps. Total force, about 10,500 men with 37 cannons. He marches through Estonia, brushing aside Russian cavalry detachments. November 29th, 1700, he reaches Lagena village, 7 miles from Narva. He fires recognition signals from his cannons. Narva answers. The fortress still holds. Peter left 2 days before Charles arrived, claimed urgent business in Moscow, left command to Charles Eugene de Croix, a general sent by Augustus as a diplomatic liaison. Some say Peter ran. Some say he went to gather reinforcements. Europe mocks him either way. The Russian army at Narva numbers between 35,000 and 38,000 men, depending on which records survive. They sit behind contravallations, field fortifications dug into a corridor facing the Swedish approach. The position is strong. Artillery pointed down the approaches. Trenches zigzagged to provide cover. 3 main divisions spread along the line. Trubetskoy commands the center with the weakest regiments. Units formed only in August and marched straight to the siege. Streltsy from Novgorod and Pskov garrisons fill gaps. The right and left divisions hold more experienced units, but even those are green compared to what is coming. Charles inspects his army on the morning of November 30th. 5'9", but looks taller because of his build. Oval face, hawk nose, blue eyes that command without speaking. Simple blue uniform with brass buttons. No gold braid, no orders of chivalry. Lieutenant General Carl Gustaf Renskield stands beside him. Renskield served in the Franco-Dutch War, fought in the Scanian War from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel. General Otto Velink commands the cavalry. 10 years in French service, rose to colonel. Both men know their trade. Charles gives the order. We attack at 2 in the afternoon. Rain falls all morning. Temperature plunges. Officers watch clouds darken and feel the storm building. Some ask to delay. The weather is turning vicious. Charles refuses. The Swedish artillery master is Johan Sjöblad, 40 years experience, wrote Sweden's first artillery regulation in 1690. 18 miles west at Pajajogi Pass, his guns deployed under dragoon cover and opened fire at close range on Russian cavalry clusters. Russians had no artillery there, had to retreat. Now at Narva, Sjöblad positions his 37 cannons for maximum effect against an enemy with 195 pieces. The math does not favor him. 2 in the afternoon. Wind changes. The blizzard hits. Snow blows horizontal, straight into Russian faces. Charles sees it and orders advance. Renskild splits the army into two columns. Infantry and cavalry mixed. The plan is to hit the Russian line in two places, split it, and roll up the pieces before they can react. The Swedes move forward at speed. The storm masks their approach until they are on top of the earthworks. Russian sentries see shapes in the white, fire pistols to raise alarm. Too late, Swedish troops smash into the fortifications. Carl Gustav Rus leads the first column. They overrun 2 redoubts in minutes. Every Russian inside dies, bayonets in close quarters. The killing is fast. 4:30 in the morning darkness. Dawn is coming, but the storm makes it irrelevant. Visibility is 20 paces. The Russian line bends. 5,000 Russian cavalry on the left flank see Swedish horsemen coming out of snow and break. They run without fighting. De Croix thinks the Swedes must be an advance guard. The numbers do not make sense to him. 10,000 men do not attack 40,000 entrenched soldiers. He positions for a main Swedish army that is not coming. The Swedish assault cuts the Russian line in 3 sections. Trubetskoy's center collapses first. His regiments trained for 3 months and now face Karelians who have drilled for years. The Streltsy are garrison troops. They hold their ground longer, but the Swedes are through the earthworks and fighting in the trenches. No artillery support reaches them because the Russians cannot see targets through snow. Swedish infantry push with socket bayonets. Russian units fragment. Some try to retreat across the Narva River. The Kamperholm Bridge is narrow. Troops pile onto it. The bridge collapses under the weight. Soldiers fall into freezing water. Many drown with armor and weapons dragging them down. The Swedish right column, commanded by Velink, hits the Russian right division. Same pattern. Shock charge. Break the line. Push through. Russian units on the right see the center disintegrating, and the cavalry fled and make the calculation. They cannot hold. Some throw down weapons. Some run for the river. Officers try to rally them, but the storm and the shock and the speed of the Swedish attack break cohesion. By evening, the Russian army is in 3 pieces with Swedes between them. Charles moves from section to section. His troops deal with each piece separately. No reinforcement between Russian units. No communication through the blizzard. Isolated groups of Russians face concentrated Swedish attacks. By nightfall, 20,000 Russian infantry surrender. The Swedes take the entire Russian artillery train, 195 cannons. Thousands of muskets, all the powder and shot. Russian casualties are somewhere between 8,000 and 18,000 dead, depending on which source you trust. Drownings in the Narva River account for hundreds. Desertions during the battle add another 10,000 men who just walked away when they saw the Swedish advance. Swedish casualties, 667 dead, around 1,200 wounded. The ratios do not make sense until you add the weather and the shock and the discipline gap. Dawn on December 1st. Charles mounts a splendid horse near the repaired Kamperholm Bridge. The 20,000 Russian prisoners walk past. Each man doffs his hat to the young king. Each regiment lays its standard at the horse's feet. The pile of silk banners grows taller. Peter's generals are in the line. Field Marshal de Croix, officers who commanded divisions, all captured. Charles releases the prisoners at dawn. They trudge east across the bridge without weapons. Russia's army is broken. Peter has almost no equipment left. If Charles invades Russia now, Peter cannot stop him, but Charles does not invade. He turns south. Augustus is still in Poland. The war is not finished. That decision gives Peter time, and Peter uses every second. If you value documented Baltic history and military analysis like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Lars Erik Höglund, Åke Salnes, and Alexander Vespalov in their comprehensive 2011 study, Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, which compiles Swedish military archives, and Robert K. Massey's 1980, Analysis Peter the Great, His Life and World, which cross-references Russian and Western European diplomatic records from the period. These are not popular history summaries. These are primary document compilations from military archives in Stockholm and Moscow. Now back to the information. Peter returns to Moscow and starts building. 1700 was supposed to be Russia's year to break into the Baltic. Instead, it is a disaster that strips the army down to nothing. But Peter treats Narva as a lesson. He hires more foreign officers, reforms training, builds foundries to cast new artillery. The army that marches out of Russia in 1701 is not the army that fled Narva. It is the beginning of what will crush Charles 9 years later. For now, Charles is unstoppable. He marches into Poland-Lithuania in 1701. The Saxon-Polish army under Augustus and Steinau had been sitting outside Riga when Charles went to Narva. Now Charles comes for them. He crosses the Duna River in July 1701. defeats the Saxons and Russians in a battle that clears the way into Courland. The Swedish army occupies Courland, a Polish vassal state. Polish nobles try to negotiate. Charles ignores them. He has decided to dethrone Augustus and install a puppet. The Polish Sam, the parliament, resists. Charles does not care. His army rolls through Poland like nothing can stop it. Battle of Klisau, July 7th, 1702. Swedish forces meet Saxon-Polish troops south of Krakow. The Swedes number about 12,000. The enemy has around 24,000. Charles attacks. The Swedish infantry advances in disciplined lines. The Saxon cavalry charges and breaks against Swedish cavalry countercharges. Polish infantry holds for a while, then crumbles when the Swedish left flank wheels and hits them from the side. Augustus retreats. The Swedes lose around 300 men. The Saxons and Poles lose over 3,000. Charles takes Krakow in September. Audacity and reputation do half the work. The city opens its gates rather than face a siege. Battle of Pultusk, May 1st, 1703. Charles defeats another Saxon-Polish force, captures Warsaw, captures Torun. The Swedish army is operating deep in enemy territory and winning every engagement. Polish nobles start switching sides. Some see Charles as the stronger bet. Some just want the war to end. Charles finds his puppet, Stanisław Leszczyński, a Polish nobleman willing to take the throne with Swedish backing. The same crowns him, Stanisław I, in September 1704. A rival confederation forms in support of Augustus, Sandomierz. Confederation backing the old king. Warsaw Confederation backing the new one. Poland splits. Charles invades Saxony in 1706 to force Augustus out permanently. Saxon territory, not Polish. Augustus is Elector of Saxony, separate from his Polish crown. Charles wants to hit him at home. The Swedish army marches into Saxony. Augustus sues for peace. Treaty of Altranstadt, signed October 13th, 1706. Augustus abdicates the Polish throne, acknowledges Stanislaw as king, breaks his alliance with Russia, pays reparations. The treaty also secures the extradition of Johann Reinhold Patkul, the Livonian noble who organized the original anti-Swedish coalition back in 1699. Charles has him broken on the wheel, public execution, 20 bones broken methodically before death, message sent. By 1706, Charles is 24 years old. He has forced Denmark out of the war, shattered Russia at Narva, conquered Poland, dethroned Augustus, installed a puppet king, and invaded Saxony to force a peace treaty. Peter sends peace feelers. Charles rejects them. Peter offers to return conquered Swedish Baltic provinces, except Ingria, where he is building St. Petersburg. Charles refuses. He wants total victory. Peter toppled from the throne. Russia broken permanently. The Swedish Empire restored to full dominance. Anything less is unacceptable. So Charles invades Russia. January 1st, 1708, the Swedish army crosses the Vistula. The force numbers around 40,000 men. Supply train, artillery, cavalry, infantry. This is the main strike. Charles plans to march on Moscow, force a decisive battle, destroy Peter's rebuilt army, and impose terms that will keep Russia weak for generations. The strategy has worked everywhere else. Denmark, Poland, Saxony. Charles has won every campaign. Why not Russia? Peter does not fight the way Charles expects. The Russian army retreats. Every time Charles advances, the Russians pull back. They burn villages, destroy crops, hide grain, drive cattle east, scorched earth. The Swedish army marches through empty land. No food for men, no fodder for horses. Charles expects to live off the land like his army did in Poland. But there is no land to live off. The Russians have burned it all. Swedish foragers find ashes. The advance slows. Supply lines stretch. Winter is coming. Charles needs reinforcements. He sent General Adam Ludwig Löwenhaupt with a supply column of 12,000 men and a massive baggage train from Riga. Löwenhaupt is supposed to meet Charles in September 1708, but Peter sends forces under Prince Alexander Menshikov to intercept. Battle of Lesnaya, October 9th, 1708. Löwenhaupt fights a running battle trying to protect the wagons. The Russians hit him in waves. Löwenhaupt loses over 6,000 men. He ditches the baggage train, burns the supplies, and runs east with the survivors. He reaches Charles in late October with less than half his original force and no supplies. Charles is now deep in enemy territory without the provisions he needs. Winter is closing in. Charles also expected to ally with the Cossacks. Ivan Mazepa, the hetman of the Cossack host, had been fighting for Peter. But Mazepa has grievances. He wants autonomy for the Cossack lands. Peter refuses. Mazepa secretly contacts Charles and promises to bring the Cossacks over. He says he can deliver thousands of fighters and open supply routes. Charles believes him. Mazeppa defects in October 1708. He brings 1,300 men. That is it, 1,300. The rest of the Cossack host stays loyal to Peter or stays neutral. Menshikov destroys Mazeppa's capital at Baturin. The Cossack rebellion dies before it starts. Charles is left with a refugee hetman and barely 1,000 extra troops. November 1708. The Swedish army goes into winter quarters in Ukraine. They set up camp, dig in, wait for spring. And the winter of 1708 to 1709 is the worst Europe has seen in 500 years. The Great Frost, rivers freeze solid, the Baltic Sea freezes, people walk between Swedish islands on ice. In the Swedish camp, men freeze in their sleep. Over 2,000 die from cold in a single night, another 2,000 crippled by frostbite, fingers and toes, noses of blackened flesh, amputations. The army that emerges in spring 1709 is smaller, weaker, and running out of options. Charles still wants battle. He is not retreating. He will not go back to Poland empty-handed. He orders Stanislaw to send reinforcements from Poland. They do not come. The Zaporozhian Cossacks promise aid. A few hundred show up. Charles decides to take a fortress, Poltava, a trading town and military depot on the Vorskla River in central Ukraine. If he takes Poltava, he gets supplies and a strong point. The siege begins in May 1709, but the Swedish army has almost no artillery left, 34 cannons total. Powder is low. The garrison at Poltava holds. Weeks pass. The Swedes cannot break the walls. Peter sees his chance. He assembles an army and marches to relieve Poltava. 80,000 men. Strong artillery train, fresh troops. The Swedish army besieging Poltava numbers about 20,000 men now. Down from 40,000 at the start of the invasion. Attrition, frostbite, disease, and the battles at Lesnaya and smaller skirmishes have bled Charles dry. Peter's army arrives and sets up entrenchments within a few hundred yards of the Swedish siege lines. He builds a counter-siege. Redoubts in a line, fortified positions. He waits. Forces Charles to either attack or retreat. Charles does not retreat. June 27th, 1709, Swedish calendar. July 8th, new style. Charles is wounded before the battle. A Russian cavalry patrol catches him in a skirmish. A ball hits his foot. He cannot walk, cannot ride, cannot command from the saddle. He hands control to Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Renskiold, the same officer who stood with him at Narva 9 years before. Renskiold now faces a force 4 times his size entrenched behind redoubts, with more artillery than the Swedes have muskets. The Swedish plan is a night attack. Surprise. Speed. Overrun the redoubts before the Russians can deploy. Infantry moves into position by 2:30 in the morning. Cavalry arrives late. They got lost in the dark. Axel Gillenkrock rides forward to scout. He sees Russians working on the nearest redoubts. Reports back. Major General Volmar Anton von Schlippenbach does a reconnaissance. Russians discover him. A pistol shot rings out. Alarm. Surprise is gone. Renskiold consults with Charles, with Karl Piper, with Lewenhaupt. Should they proceed? Dawn is coming. The element of shock is gone. But Charles says to attack. Renskiold quotes him directly. In the name of God, then, let us go forward. It is nearly 4 in the morning. Light is breaking. Carl Gustaf Roos leads one column, the same officer who overran the first redoubts at Narva. His men hit the first 2 Russian positions, kill every defender, push through, but the rest of the line holds. By 4:30, the sun is up. Russian artillery opens fire. The Swedes are in the open, canister shot, solid round shot. Swedish ranks take casualties. The cavalry tries to charge. Russian musket volleys cut them down. The Swedish infantry advances in lines, disciplined, professional. But they are advancing into prepared positions with no artillery support. The Russians pour fire into them from 3 sides. Swedish units lose cohesion. Officers fall. The advance stalls. Peter counterattacks. 80,000 Russians against 13,000 Swedes. The numbers tell the story. Swedish left flank crumbles. Center holds for a while, then breaks under pressure. Right flank tries to retreat in order, but the Russians are already around them. Swedish units fragment. Some try to cut their way out. Some surrender. Renskiold is captured. Field Marshal taken prisoner. Major Generals Schlippenbach, Stackelberg, Sutter Hamilton, Prince Maximilian Emanuel, Karl Piper, Charles' closest advisor, all captured. Charles is carried from the field by his officers. 543 men escape with him. They ride south to the Dnieper River, cross it, keep going. Ottoman Empire, Bendry in Moldavia. Charles spends 5 years in exile there. Peter will not let him return. The rest of the Swedish army, about 19,000 men, tries to retreat. They march south toward the Dnieper. Russian cavalry harasses them. No food, no ammunition. Exhausted, they reach Perevalokna on July 11th. Russian forces surround them. Leeuwenhoek negotiates surrender. The entire army lays down arms. Prisoners, sent to Siberia. Peter throws a banquet on the Poltava battlefield. 2 large tents. Russian officers and captured Swedish generals drink together. Peter toasts the Swedish generals as his teachers in the art of war. Some think it is magnanimity. Voltaire thinks it is a warning to his own officers about loyalty. The Battle of Poltava destroys the Swedish Empire. Sweden never adds new territory after July 8th, 1709. Within a year, Sweden loses more. George I of Britain brings Britain and Prussia into the war against Sweden. Denmark re-enters. The anti-Swedish coalition revives with fresh energy. Russian forces capture Riga, the largest city in Swedish Livonia, in 1710. They take Tallinn, they occupy Estonia. Finland falls in 1714. The Baltic coast, Sweden's lifeline, is gone. Swedish Pomerania is invaded. The empire crumbles. Charles eventually returns to Sweden in November 1714. He tries to salvage what is left, opens a Norwegian front against Denmark, plans to take Norwegian fortresses and force Denmark back to the negotiating table. Siege of Fredriksten Fortress in Norway. December 11th, 1718, Charles is in the trenches inspecting forward positions. A shot hits him in the head. He dies instantly. Some say a Norwegian musket ball. Some say assassination by a Swedish officer tired of endless war. The truth is lost. Charles is 36 years old. His body is brought back to Sweden. The war continues for 3 more years without him. Treaties of Stockholm and Nystad signed 1719 to 1721. Sweden cedes Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and part of Karelia to Russia. Russia is now the dominant Baltic power. Peter's window to the west is secured. St. Petersburg thrives. The Swedish Empire is over. The meteoric rise ends in collapse, all because of the decisions made after Narva in 1700. Charles had Peter beaten. Russia was broken. The army destroyed. The artillery captured. If Charles had invaded in 1701, he could have imposed any terms he wanted. But he turned south to Poland instead, spent 6 years chasing Augustus, gave Peter time to rebuild. And when Charles finally invaded Russia in 1708, he faced an army that had learned from defeat, an army that would not break like it did at Narva. Narva teaches that numerical advantage means nothing if discipline collapses, that weather is a weapon if you know how to use it. That shock and speed overcome entrenchments if your troops are trained and your enemy is not. 10,000 Swedes shattered 40,000 Russians because Charles attacked in a blizzard and his men executed with precision. But Narva also teaches that victory without follow-through is wasted. Charles won the battle and lost the war because he did not press his advantage. Poltava teaches the opposite lesson, that numbers eventually matter, that you cannot replace losses if you are operating far from home, that scorched earth works if you have the land to burn. Peter lost at Narva and learned. Charles won at Narva and thought he was invincible. The Great Northern War was decided not on the battlefield, but in the decisions between battles. Charles chose Poland over Russia in 1700. That choice gave Peter 9 years to prepare. And when the armies met again at Poltava, the student had become the master. The graves tell the story. 2 mass graves southwest of the Russian camp at Poltava, 500 meters from where Peter's tent stood. The bodies of Russian soldiers killed in the battle. Peter buried his own dead with honor. The Swedish dead were buried in mass pits without markers. The prisoners marched to Siberia never returned. A few made it back decades later when treaties allowed. Most died in exile. Charles spent 5 years in Bendery living on Ottoman charity. The king who won at Narva and broke Russia became a refugee dependent on foreign hospitality. The arc from triumph to ruin took 9 years, from November 1700 to July 1709. The Swedish meteor burned bright and fell hard. Poltava was not an ending. It was a fulcrum. A single day in July 1709 that tilted the world. For 9 years, Charles XII had been the storm. He had broken Denmark, mastered Poland, humbled Saxony, and shattered Russia's first modern army at Narva. Now the storm had broken itself against the rock of Peter's new Russia. The Swedish army was gone. 19,000 men marched to Perevalokna on the Dnieper River and laid down their arms. Their generals, including the formidable Leeuwenhoek and Renskield, became prisoners of the Tsar. They would be paraded through Moscow in a Roman-style triumph. Most would die in Siberian exile. Charles himself, wounded and carried on a litter, escaped with 543 men. They crossed the Dnieper and rode south into the territory of the Ottoman Empire. He became a guest. Then a problem. Then a prisoner of Sultan Ahmed III in the Moldavian town of Bendery. The King of Sweden was now a refugee. Peter the Great did not waste the victory. While Charles plotted from his exile, Peter consolidated. The road to the Baltic was clear. In 1710, the new Russian army, the army that had learned its lessons in the ashes of Narva and proved them in the fields of Poltava, moved with methodical force. Riga, the jewel of Swedish Livonia and its largest city, fell after a brutal siege. Reval, now Tallinn, in Swedish Estonia, surrendered. Viborg, the key fortress guarding the approaches to Finland, was taken. The entire Baltic coastline that Sweden had controlled for a century was now in Russian hands. Peter's window to the west was not just open, he had taken possession of the entire house. The war for Sweden now became a desperate fight for survival. The empire was not just bleeding. Its limbs were being amputated one by one while its head was in another country, powerless to intervene. Charles of Invading refused to accept defeat. He was not a king who negotiated. He was a king who dictated terms. From his camp on Ottoman soil, he became a diplomat of chaos. His single-minded goal was to push the Ottoman Empire into a war with Russia. He lobbied the court in Constantinople, promising a Swedish alliance, playing on old Turkish-Russian rivalries. For 2 years he schemed, a constant, irritating presence on the Sultan's border. He succeeded. In 1711, the Sultan declared war. A massive Ottoman army, led by the Grand Vizier Baltachi Mehmet Pasha, marched north. They cornered Peter and his entire army on the Pruth River. The Russians were trapped. No food, no water, surrounded by a force 4 times their size. It was Poltava in reverse. Peter's new Russia was on the verge of annihilation. Charles rode from Bendary, expecting to see the final destruction of his enemy. But Peter was a pragmatist. Charles was a warrior. Where Charles would have fought to the last man, Peter negotiated. He bribed the Grand Vizier. He promised to return the fortress of Azov, to dismantle his forts on the Black Sea, and to not interfere in Polish affairs. The Grand Vizier, perhaps fearing a desperate Russian breakout, accepted the terms. The Russian army was allowed to march away. When Charles arrived, the deal was done. He confronted the Grand Vizier in a rage, accusing him of treason and bribery. The Turk was unmoved. Charles had pushed the Ottomans to war, but he could not command them. The chance to destroy Peter was lost. The king's exile dragged on. He had become an expensive and dangerous guest. The Sultan called him Ironhead for his stubbornness. The hospitality soured. In February 1713, the Sultan ordered his removal. Charles refused to leave. The result was the Kalabalak at Bendary, a Turkish word for skirmish or tumult. Charles, with a few dozen loyal Karelians, barricaded himself in his house and fought against thousands of Ottoman janissaries and Tatar horsemen. He fought with pistols and sword from a window until the Turks set the house on fire and swarmed him as he tried to escape. He was finally overpowered and taken prisoner. The warrior king's personal battle against an army was a bizarre footnote, a testament to his character, but a strategic dead end. He remained a captive for another year. While Charles played king and prisoner in a foreign land, Sweden fought on. The kingdom was exhausted, drained of men and silver. Denmark had re-entered the war. Prussia and Hanover eyed Swedish lands in Germany. But Sweden was not yet broken. A new army was raised from militia and raw recruits. Command fell to one of Charles's best generals, Magnus Stenbock. In 1710, a Danish army invaded Scania, the southern tip of Sweden, aiming to reclaim the province lost decades before. Stenbock, with his hastily assembled force, met them at the Battle of Helsingborg. He crushed the Danish invasion. It was a stunning victory, born of desperation, that saved the Swedish heartland. Stenbock became a national hero, but one victory could not stop the tide. Stenbock took his army to northern Germany in 1712 to defend Sweden's Pomeranian territories. At the Battle of Gadabusch, he won another brilliant victory against a combined Saxon-Danish force. It was the last great field victory for the Swedish army in the war. It proved that Karelian tactics and discipline were still superior, but it could not change the strategic reality. Stenbock's army was soon trapped, cut off from supply, and in 1713 he was forced to surrender at Tönning. Another Swedish army was lost. To the east, the war was even more brutal. With the Swedish army gone from the theater, Russian forces occupied Finland. This period, from 1714 to 1721, became known in Finnish history as the Great Wrath. The occupation was harsh, villages were burned, resources plundered, and thousands of civilians were killed or deported to Russia as forced labor. The Russian galley fleet, a new creation of Peter's, dominated the coastal waters. At the Battle of Gangut in 1714, the Russian fleet trapped and destroyed a Swedish naval squadron. It was a naval Poltava, a victory that signaled the arrival of Russian sea power and sealed the fate of Finland. The Baltic Sea was becoming a Russian lake. In November 1714, Charles finally returned. After 5 years of exile, he was released by the Ottomans. He rode incognito on horseback across Europe in 14 days, a legendary journey that took him from the Black Sea to Stralsund, the last major Swedish fortress in German Pomerania. He arrived unannounced, a ghost from the past, but his presence electrified the defenders. The city was already under siege by a coalition of Prussian, Danish, and Saxon forces. Charles took personal command. For a year, he led a desperate defense, personally leading attacks, sharing the risks of the common soldier, but the odds were impossible. In December 1715, with the city about to fall, he escaped in a small fishing boat in the dead of night, moments before the final enemy assault. He had lost his last foothold on the European continent. He arrived back in Sweden itself for the first time in 15 years. The kingdom he returned to was on the brink of collapse. The population had shrunk. The treasury was empty. The fields were tended by women and old men. The constant drain of the war had brought the country to its knees. Charles, however, knew only one way forward: to keep fighting. He turned to a new chief minister, Baron Georg Heinrich von Goertz. Goertz was a brilliant and unscrupulous financier. He kept the war funded through any means necessary. He issued emergency copper coins with no real value, levied crippling taxes, and forced loans from anyone with remaining wealth. He was hated by the nobility and the people, but he produced the money Charles needed for one last gamble. With the Baltic lost, Charles looked west. He would attack Denmark through its conjoined kingdom, Norway. The plan was audacious. He would conquer Norway and use it as a bargaining chip, trading it back to Denmark in exchange for peace and perhaps the return of the German provinces. In 1716, he launched his first invasion of Norway. It failed. The Swedes took Christiania, now Oslo, but could not take the key fortresses and were forced to withdraw. Undeterred, Charles prepared for a second attempt. In 1718, he assembled an army of 35,000 men for a two-pronged invasion. He would personally lead the main force against the formidable Fredriksten fortress, which guarded the road to southern Norway. The siege began in November. The weather was cold, the ground frozen. Progress was slow. Charles, as always, was at the forefront. He scorned personal danger, believing in a form of fatalism. He spent his days and nights in the forward trenches, overseeing the placement of siege batteries, encouraging his men. On the night of November 30th, 1718a, according to the Swedish calendar, he was in a forward trench, peering over the parapet at the enemy fortress, lit by star shells and enemy fire. He rested his head on his hand, exposed to the Norwegian defenders. A single projectile struck him in the head, entering his left temple and exiting the right. He died instantly, collapsing into the mud of the trench. He was 36 years old. The king was dead. A cloud of mystery immediately surrounded his death. Was it a lucky shot from a Norwegian musketeer, or was it assassination? Many in the Swedish nobility and army were weary of the endless war and the king's absolute ruinous power. Goertz's financial policies had created powerful enemies. The French military engineer who accompanied Charles, André Sicre, was suspected. The evidence remains inconclusive to this day, a debate for historians. What is certain is the result. With Charles dead, the will to fight evaporated. The invasion of Norway was immediately abandoned. The army marched home. Baron Goertz was arrested, put on a show trial, and swiftly executed. The absolute monarchy that had given Charles his power died with him. His sister, Ulrika Eleonora, was elected to the throne, but only after accepting a new constitution that transferred power to the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament. Sweden's Age of Liberty began. Born from the exhaustion of absolute war, the war itself limped on for 3 more years. Without Charles, Sweden sought peace, but Peter was not yet satisfied. To force the issue, he unleashed his galley fleet on the Swedish coast itself. From 1719 to 1721, Russian forces conducted amphibious raids, the Rout, Russian pillage. They landed with impunity, burning towns, villages, and ironworks from north of Stockholm down to Norrköping. They destroyed the foundations of the Swedish economy. The Swedish Navy could not stop the shallow draft galleys in the archipelago. It was total war, brought to the Swedish heartland. Finally, Sweden could take no more. The treaties of Stockholm with Hanover, Prussia, and Denmark, and finally the Treaty of Nystad with Russia in 1721 brought the Great Northern War to an end. The price of peace was the formal dismemberment of the Swedish Empire. Sweden ceded Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and a large part of Finnish Karelia, including the fortress of Viborg, to Russia. Peter the Great had achieved his life's ambition. Russia was now the undisputed dominant power in the Baltic. His new capital, St. Petersburg, built on conquered Swedish land, was secure. In celebration, the Russian Senate conferred upon him the titles of Peter the Great and Emperor of all Russia. The Russian Empire was born. Sweden's empire was dead. From the blizzard at Narva to the frozen trench at Fredriksten, the arc of a king and his empire had run its course. The war had lasted 21 years. It shifted the balance of power in Northern Europe forever. Charles XII, the Swedish meteor, had won spectacular victories but refused to make peace. Peter the Great had suffered a catastrophic defeat but refused to give up. In the end, it was Peter's persistence, his willingness to learn, adapt, and sacrifice, that built an empire from the ashes of Charles's victories.